but it's on. You get anything?
Yeah, I am now.
Okay. All right. So themes in James, practical behavior, wisdom, double-mindedness. And this section we're just going to call faith that justifies is faith that works. Familiar section to us, important section. And we put James here in the order of things for the very reason that we did Romans and Galatians, which are connected in much of their teaching. And then James, which sort of is the other side of the story, another way of looking at justification. And that happens here in James chapter 2. So we'll be talking about that. James 2 and verse 14, what does it profit, my brethren, if someone says he has faith but does not have works, can faith save him? If a brother or sister is naked and destitute of daily food, and one of you says to them, depart in peace, be warmed and filled, but you do not give them the things which are needed for the body, what does it profit? Thus also faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. Someone will say, you have faith, I have works. Show me your faith without your works, and I will show you my faith by my works. So what profit is faith without works? And it's a rhetorical question, and the answer is not, it doesn't profit at all. That's to be understood, obviously. So faith without works is unprofitable. It cannot save us in the absence of works. I don't think a statement could hardly be any clearer. That faith cannot save him. And to turn it around and put a positive statement on it that James makes there at the end of verse 14. That faith cannot save him. And he says clearly that that faith without works is dead. But faith without works is like telling the needy to be warmed and filled, but not providing anything for their needs. Your sentiment doesn't do anything, is not helpful whatsoever. And so here's one illustration. He'll use three more illustrations to show us the problem of faith without works. And here's the first of those illustrations. Faith without works then is equally useless, I think is what I put on the screen, as love that doesn't demonstrate itself in action. I think most people of any age can understand this. If your parents, you could use this with the kids, if your parents say they love you, but they don't care for you, or they don't give you birthday presents on your birthday, or whatever it might be, if they don't show that love for you, then you have, concerns that they might not love you. If your wife says she loves you, if your husband says he loves you, and he doesn't show it in tangible ways, you have concerns about that. It's useless just to say it without action. And we understand that when it comes to love. We understand that when it comes to helping the needy. And we need to understand it when it comes to faith. The great chapter in the Bible on faith is Hebrews chapter 11. And all the way through, faith always does something. By faith, Noah built the ark. Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, all the way through, down to Moses and the prophets and so on and so forth in Hebrews 11, all of those examples. So faith without works is dead. It's useless. It has no function or no profit. So it cannot be shown without works. And you can say all day long you have faith, but you can't show it without doing something. You can't demonstrate it without doing something. That's the very purpose of the action. That's the very purpose of the work. And so there are going to be three more illustrations that demonstrate that. The first of them is demons have faith, but they don't work. And so that faith doesn't save them. Verse 19, you believe that there is one God, you do well. The demons believe and tremble. And then he says again, do you want to know, foolish man, that faith without works is dead? It's an interesting study to go back and look at Jesus' interaction with people that were demon-possessed and to hear in the demons' own words what they thought about Christ. In Luke chapter 4 and verse 41, Luke records that as he was casting out demons, demons came out of many, crying out and saying, "You are the Christ, the Son of God." Now, there's not only people who believe that he's the Christ, the Son of God, but they're confessing. They're not people, they're demons, but they're confessing that he's the Christ, the Son of God. And yet nobody would say, well, the demons are thereby saved. That's clearly understood. In Luke chapter 8 and verse 28, as Jesus interacts with the man there that had demons, the demon speaks out and says, "What have I to do with you, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?" So the demons not only knew who Jesus was, that he was the Son of God, that he was the Christ, they actually confessed it on multiple occasions, and yet nobody would say that they're saved. So surely more than believing and more than confessing is required for salvation. The demons believe, yet they tremble. They're not expecting to be saved. They know they're not saved. They tremble in fear of their punishment. And then the big example in this text, the big illustration, I think, of James' point is Abraham. And he says, picking up the reading in verse 21, "Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered Isaac his son on the altar? Do you see that faith was working together with his works, and by works faith was made perfect? And the scripture was fulfilled which says, Abraham believed God, and it was accounted to him for righteousness, and he was called the friend of God. You see then that a man is justified by works and not by faith only." So he follows each of these illustrations with a very plain statement about the necessary connection between faith and works. Twice he said, after he talks about the illustration of, you say, "Be warmed and filled," but you don't give them the things needed for the body, he said, then faith without works is dead. And then he talks about the demons, and faith without works is dead. And now he talks about Abraham, and he follows that up by saying, a man's justified by works and not by faith only. And then he'll go to Rahab, and then we'll say again the third time, faith without works is dead. So could we get the point any clearer? Could he make it any plainer? Saying the same essential thing three times, and then, in other words, a fourth time, that faith, if it doesn't have works, will not justify. So let's think about this example of Abraham a little bit. We might take just a few minutes on this. I think it's important to look at it the way James is looking at it, and it's not really a different way of looking at it. It's a different application, a different perspective that helps us maybe get the whole picture of how God is considering Abraham's justification. Abraham offered Isaac on the altar in Genesis chapter 22. And if you go back there, I know you know the story, and it might be good as you're teaching this lesson, obviously, to go back and review the story somewhat, especially if you're wanting to focus on this story and what you want to teach here. But in Genesis 22, God tells Abraham to go sacrifice his son on Moriah. And a lot of great things about this. It says in verse 3, Abraham rose early in the morning. He didn't dawdle. He just got up early in the morning and went. It was, took a bit of doing to get there. They get close. They leave their servants behind. And Abraham goes to sacrifice his son and actually has his son bound and the knife out ready to do that when the angel called him from heaven, verse 11, and says, Abraham, Abraham. He said, here I am. And he said, do not lay your hand on the lad, nor do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God. Y'all ever thought about that? Did God not know that before? Was Abraham, when does the Bible say Abraham was justified by faith? When is that? Where does that verse come from? It doesn't come from Genesis 22. Where does it come from? When he believed. Genesis 15. When, you remember the deal, God takes him out, shows him the stars, and they make a covenant. And verse 6 of Genesis 15, I believe. Abraham believed God and it was counted to him for righteousness. What about when Abraham left Ur of the Chaldees? What does the scripture say about that? Was that by faith? By faith.
Not knowing where he's going.
Not knowing where he's going. What about when he received strength to sire a son when he's 100 years old? He do that by faith? And he believed God and it was counted to him for righteousness. That's Romans 4. So what we see is a lifetime of faith demonstrated by action. Correct? And that justifies him. I do think it's important when we talk about this. I was talking with Wayne about it a minute ago about a comment that a commentator, favorite commentator of ours makes, but he's not right about it. But I think it's important when we talk about this to realize these New Testament examples aren't saying, okay, well, when Abraham sacrificed Isaac, it was like he was being baptized, and that's actually when he got saved. Or when he left Ur of the Chaldees, that's when he got saved. Or when he was standing there believing that he'd be the father of many nations and looking at the stars, that's when he got saved. Or when he received strength, that's not how that worked. What the New Testament writers are doing is they're picking out different events in Abraham's life to illustrate a principle of justification by faith. You understand that? Which in every case worked in Abraham's life. In every case. And when God says in Genesis 22, now I know, he's not saying I didn't know this before. He'd already said, he's seen it from Abraham all along. But what he's saying is exactly what James is saying. That's how Abraham demonstrated his faith. He was in that action demonstrating faith. Now I know, I see, because you have demonstrated your faith in sacrificing your son. You understand? So that's really the point that all the writers are making, although interestingly, you're looking at different times in Abraham's life when the New Testament writers make that application, which is fascinating in itself, a character study of Abraham's whole life, a life of faith, living that way from such a long time. But that I believe is what we need to understand. Abraham's working faith justified him. He obeyed when he was called to go out to the land. He obeyed when he was sacrificing Isaac. All of that is works. But those things were done by faith. Hebrews 11, 8 and 9, Hebrews 11, 17 through 19. And so faith and works coupled together to make Abraham justified. Somebody else want to throw in some thoughts there, Jeff?
This may be too much in the weeds to bring up to the children classes, but this Abraham's example that James mentions and Paul mentions in Romans 4, it's the classic refutation to the old Calvinistic idea of Abraham had this salvation experience or his experience of faith. You get rid of the Holy Spirit and you had that power, that zapping, that one-time moment. And all these passages, as you mentioned, are in different points of his life. And so it does illustrate, it's not a one-time moment, it's a lifetime of obedient faith, where God says, do this, or I expect this of you, and he demonstrates his firm belief and trust in God by simply complying with what God said. And it's the perfect example to refute that Calvinistic idea that's taught in so many churches.
Yes, and at every juncture in life, and it's really, in that sense, it's the same for us today. When God tells us to do something, we do it by faith. We are right in his eyes, and that's what justification is all about. So I think that, not to belabor the point, as Jeff said, but and because of all of that, he's called the friend of God, and that's a beautiful thing to share with children. When God says it, and you believe it, and you do it, you make yourself God's friend, as opposed to being, as Paul had concerned us with, being enemies by our sins. Now we're friends of God. Yes, sir.
When you believe and do it, ties right back to James chapter 1. Doers of the word, and not hearers only. James teaching that same principle.
James is a book of action, and that's not one of the things I have on the themes, but it's definitely you're an action person if you're doing what James says. All right, good thoughts and comments, and appreciate appreciate it. Let's look at Rahab. Again, noticing, first of all, it's what's said about Abraham. Do you see that faith is working together with his works, faith working with works, and by works faith was made perfect. And then in verse 24, you see that a man is justified by works and not by faith only. It says that again. And then likewise Rahab the harlot was also justified by works when she received the messengers and sent them out another way. Again, a familiar story to us, recorded in Joshua 2. Rahab had faith in the Lord because she had heard what God's people did to Sihon and Og, and how he had given them the victory over those nations, and so they were in fear of God because of those facts, and that brought faith to Rahab. The salvation of herself and her household was dependent upon not just really an act, but acts of faith. She hid the spies and sent them out another way. But do you remember the deal that was struck between the spies and Rahab? You have to keep this a secret, you know. What was another thing? Have to sing the scarlet cord, right? And if we don't see the scarlet cord, then, and who's going to be saved? Got to be in the house with the cord. And so you have conditions that have to be met. Did Rahab meet all of those? By faith. By faith. And so I have a sermon I used to preach called Scarlet Cord Salvation, paralleling that to baptism. So here's just the thing. You know, you say, well, I don't know, what does baptism have to do with it? What does the scarlet cord have to do with it? But that's what she did by faith, right? And that's how faith is. You just believe it because God said it, and you do it. You act accordingly, and God saves you and He justifies you, and that's how He is all the way through. So that story of Rahab's a powerful story and beautiful. We need to hurry on. Faith without works is dead. He says it in verse 17, verse 20, and verse 26. As the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without works is dead also. And that's the thing. There's so many people today in the denominational world that sadly are claiming to be saved by a dead faith. And Calvin has just foisted that on the world. And so much of the world believes it. And it's just such a misunderstanding of Paul in Romans and coupled with Galatians and James. So
shows what one man can do, like Martin Luther. It's the effect one man can have on.
Yeah. You talk about influence for. I shared this with this slide. I redid it a little bit, but I kind of shared it with you in the introduction. I want to go quickly again. Paul teaches justification by faith apart from the works of the law. All right, that's what he says in Romans 3:28. James shows that justification is by works, that faith alone is dead. He says that 3 times. So are those consistent? Yeah. Paul and James are using the terms faith and works differently. That's the key to understanding that. And we don't have to just insert that ourselves. They define faith and works for us, the way they use them in sentences, those words in sentences. So Paul describes faith that's complete trust in God. It involves absolute obedience to His will. A couple of passages just real quickly there. Romans 1 and verse 5. Through Him we have received grace and apostleship for obedience to the faith. And then Romans 16, according to the commandment of an everlasting God for obedience to the faith. So in Romans, the faith is to be obeyed. Obedience and faith, again, go hand in hand. That's faith and works, right? And that's what brings salvation in Romans. And in Romans chapter 6 and verse 17, God be thanked that though you were slaves of sin, you obeyed from the heart that form of doctrine to which you were delivered. And having been set free from sin, you became slaves of righteousness, right? Romans 6. So you've obeyed. That's what made you free from sin. So in this, people want to single out verses in Romans and say, well, Paul's just saying obedience isn't involved. He's saying obedience is involved. Beginning, end, and middle, he says it. On the other hand, James is considering faith as a mere mental acknowledgement. Just think about the demons, right? That's the kind of faith he's talking about. They have that kind of faith. And that does not save. In order for that faith to save, you've got to put the works of obedience with it. In Romans, it's already with it. But here, in James, you have to add it. So Paul's works that he's talking about, so both of them are talking about faith in different senses. Paul's works are works of the law. He plainly says that, works of the law, or works of which we could boast, so works of merit. So I've kept the law perfectly so I can, I've earned my own salvation. You're not saved by that. Okay, can't be. James involves effort that has to accompany faith in order to make it worth anything, and that's been clear in several passages that we just read. So again, they're looking at faith and works. In Romans, faith is all-encompassing. In James, faith is limited and needs works with it. Faith is just mental assent. You see the difference? And in Romans, works are theoretically all-encompassing. I'm going to do all these works and I'm going to be saved by that. And Paul's saying, no, faith is what saves you. You don't merit it. And so those are some of the distinctions. I'm not doing a great job of explaining that, but it's really easy. Once you kind of just get some simple points there, and it's not really as hard as folks make it. So there's a lot of consistency there. We need to go on. We've got limited time here to look at chapter 3. My brethren, let not many of you become teachers, knowing that we shall receive a stricter judgment. At first, that statement seems also to contradict some other things we read in Scripture, which encourage us to be teachers. The word he uses for teachers here is a word that's used over 50 times in the New Testament. Most of the time, actually, the majority of the times it's used in reference to Jesus. And in the King James Version, it would often be translated master. But it's an idea of a master teacher. So it's not just talking about teaching, which other scriptures tell us we all need to be doing some of, but it's this kind of a position of teaching over and having that responsibility. And he says, don't be so quick to take up that place, because you're going to receive the stricter judgment. Why would that be? Why do teachers receive the stricter judgment? And that's not in the text. I'm just asking you to think about that.
Communicating what people need to do, and if they're communicating something that isn't following God's law, then they will be held accountable.
All right, so then you're accountable for, what you're doing. You're also accountable for what you're teaching, and it better be accurate. And what about how your example matches your teaching? If you're telling everybody this, you sure better be walking the walk if you're talking the talk, right? And so that's stricter judgment. You can just think about this maybe 3 or 4 different ways that, sure enough, those that are teachers are going to receive the stricter judgment. The Bible, I think, has some things to say about that in different ways. False teachers are going to be judged, kind of use the word harshly, and the Bible talks about that in multiple places. But the point is, he's not trying to say, don't teach others the truth, don't share knowledge of God's word with others, but he is saying, if you take sort of, we might even call it the office of a teacher. I don't really like the word, but it is scriptural. It's a function that God has placed in the church in congregations. So for instance, Acts 13, there were teachers in the church in Antioch. And there are like 5 names that are listed as the teachers in the church in Antioch. In 1 Corinthians 12, you have God has placed some in the church, first apostles, then prophets, then, and then you have the same kind of list nearly in Ephesians 4. So you have similar statements about having teachers placed as a special function, maybe I can use that term, in the church. And that's the teaching position, if you will, that James is talking about. All right, the sort of the, well, he's the Bible class teacher, you know, that kind of thing, and they'll receive that stricter judgment. And the thing is about it too, what's the slippery slope for teachers is that they're using their tongues a lot, like I'm using my tongue a lot tonight, and the more you say, the more liable you are to say something that you shouldn't say. In the multitude of words, sin is not wanting, you know, what the wise man said. So there's just the danger of saying more words, you're liable to say something that's wrong. And that too is a problem. That sort of is where James leads us to. He says, for we all stumble in many things. Verse 2, if anyone does not stumble in word, he's a perfect man, able to bridle the whole body also. So the tongue tests our self-control to the fullest extent. Another way of saying that is, your problem in teaching is the tongue. And if you can, control that, you can do everything else because it's the hardest thing to do. You see him saying that? That's the hardest thing to do, is control the tongue. So, don't be many teachers, kind of backfilling that. Don't be many teachers because you got to control the tongue if you're going to be a teacher.
So do you think that we in verse 2 is talking specifically to teachers? So therefore the following verses, I've always read those verses that it's really for everyone.
It is.
Okay, now that you said that, I'm looking at it in a different way.
Yeah, I think what he says in verse 2, it flows forward into instruction for all of us. But what he said in verse 1 is partially explained by the first part of verse 2. And again, here I may have made a mistake when teaching, and to illustrate how easy that is to do, I probably just did that. In many things we all stumble, and it's hard to explain even something like that. It's a great illustration of it, Gary. So you don't leave the wrong impression with people. Well, Steve was saying that all this context applies to just teachers. I could see how you get that out of what I said. See, but that's not what I'm saying. But if I had said that, it would be a perfect illustration. If you hadn't corrected me, it would be, so great job of making it all come together.
So to this point, what's the difference in we and verse 1, 2, and 3?
Well, I think he's including himself among the teachers in verse 1. He is a teacher. So that explains the we there. I think the we in verse 2 is generally we all, and he's including everybody in that, probably humankind. And then the we in verse 3 is what people just generally do when they're trying to control horses. So he's definitely using a pronoun with no antecedent in all three verses, but we are to use our what we call reasoning to understand the implication that's necessary. Y'all follow? Okay. So we all stumble in many things. If anyone does not stumble in word, he's a perfect man, able to bridle the whole body also. Indeed, we put bits in horses' mouths that they may obey us, and we turn their whole body. If we can bridle the tongue, we can bridle the whole body. And I like, again, please don't misunderstand this, he segues from one thing to the next in the most interesting way. He puts, like in verse 2, he used the idea of bridling the body, and then you got the idea of a bridle in your head, and then he talks about putting the bit in the horse's mouth, and that controls the horse. And so he's taking that same metaphor but applying it to the next thing. And we're able to control the horse that way. And so the tongue is small but powerful. And he uses these three illustrations. It's like putting a bit in a horse's mouth, small thing, but you can control a huge animal with that. The rudder on a ship, you control a huge ship with a fairly small rudder. And the spark that ignites a great fire. He goes on to say, even the tongue is a little member, boasts great things, see how great a forest a little fire kindles. So 3 illustrations of 3 small things that have great power. And that's like the tongue. He says the tongue is a fire. It's a world of iniquity. The tongue is so set among our members that it defiles the whole body, sets on fire the course of nature, and is set on fire by hell. And again, one illustration segues into the next point. So that you can imagine the tongue's a fire. It's like that little spark that ignites this thing and burns down a whole forest. And then he takes that and applies it to you, and that tongue sets you on fire, so to speak, destroys you spiritually. See how he does that? The tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity. The tongue is so set among our members, that's within us, that it defiles the whole body. It burns us down, like the spark burns the forest down. And it's set on fire, the course of nature, it's set on fire by hell. I'm not sure that I have the time or the understanding to really delve into all that Paul is saying, James is saying there, sorry. About this world of iniquity. The word world there is cosmos. It's the whole cosmos of iniquity that just sets us all on fire. And there's all kinds of sins, a world of iniquity that you can commit with the tongue. False teaching, idle talk, lying, slander, backbiting, evil speaking, gossip, tale-bearing, filthy language, profanity, boasting, flattery, and that's not all everything. So, just a world of iniquity that just burns you down. The tongue can defile an entire person for the entirety of their life. And it is set on fire by hell itself, as if, again, he pictures the place where people who are consumed spiritually will go, and sort of reverses that, and that's what has set them on fire. It's sort of the reversal of that metaphor. All right, so the tongue is untamable and poisonous, he says. Verse 7 and 8. Every kind of beast and bird, reptile, or creature of the sea is tamed and has been tamed by mankind. That is not every last creature is tamed, but could be tamed. There are all kinds of creatures. That's what he's saying. But the tongue, no one can tame the tongue. It is unruly evil, full of deadly poison. Unruly carries with it the idea of untamable, obviously, cannot be restrained. Not only can it not be tamed, it can't really be restrained to such a point that you could trust it. You can't take your eye off of it. Don't take your eye off of it. Don't ignore it because you can't trust it. It's an unruly evil. It's full of deadly poison. And so he goes on to illustrate that the outcome of not keeping your eye on your tongue, that's a weird metaphor, keeping your eye on your tongue. But he says in verse 9, with it we bless God our Father, and with it we curse men who've been made in the similitude of God. Out of the same mouth proceed blessing and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not to be so. Does a spring send forth fresh water and bitter from the same opening? Can a fig tree, my brethren, bear olives, or a grapevine bear figs? Thus no spring yields forth both salt water and fresh. So it's just unnatural and not right to have blessing and cursing coming out of the same mouth. Again, it's an illustration of double-mindedness. The double tongue is another illustration of double-mindedness. It's like your tongue's being controlled by two brains. Okay, it's just another illustration of that. And it's the kind of illustrations he's using, it's not a natural thing. It's unnatural. Might be better to say it's unspiritual, but that's the illustration that he uses.
It's an impossible thing.
Right.
It's impossible that fresh water, salt water, everything.
All the things he mentions are impossible. You're right. In the natural world. Yeah. So I think that shows the extreme of, if you are blessing and cursing out of your same mouth, how really contradictory that is. Okay. He talks about wisdom in this last section. Who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show. Again, there you have action. Show something that's internal, but you show it by external. Very similar to what he said about faith. Let him show by good conduct that his works are done in meekness of wisdom. If you have bitter envy and self-seeking in your hearts, do not boast and lie against the truth. This wisdom does not descend from above, but is earthly, sensual, and demonic. Spiritual leaders have special need of wisdom. We all do. But someone who is in a position where he should be wise and who may claim to have wisdom needs to demonstrate that. I think that's what he's getting to. This may relate somewhat back to verse 1 about the teachers. But whoever would say he's wise and understanding, that seems to imply he's putting himself forward as a leader in some sense in the church. He needs to show that that's the case. So wisdom should be taught by teachers, elders, preachers, moms and dads, all sorts of people. Wisdom from God is from God and is taught by prayer. He talked about that in chapter 1. When wisdom is demonstrated by works done in meekness. What's meekness? Strength under control. It's exactly how it's defined. W. Vine defines it that way. The stallion that is controlled by the rider, all that power and all that strength, but he's controlled. Wisdom is demonstrated by works done in meekness. Self-seeking wisdom is earthly, we saw. It's sensual, having to do with the desires of the flesh. It's demonic, comes from the devil. If it's self-seeking, it can't be wisdom. Can I say that? If it's self-seeking, it cannot be wisdom. It's not heavenly. It's earthly, it's sensual, it's demonic. So envy and self-seeking result in confusion and disorder. Every evil thing, all of that's going to come when we don't use heavenly wisdom. These qualities of wisdom that's from above, he says wisdom that's from above is pure, peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy, without partiality, without hypocrisy. Heavenly wisdom is not double-minded. You know, that's a fruit of the Spirit kind of list right there almost. You could just preach a whole series of sermons on that. So many good things come from wisdom that's from above. The fruit of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. The fruit of righteousness, doing the right thing, and treating others with righteousness and wisdom, that's sown in peace. You don't have to be ugly to do that. You don't have to be aggressive. You don't have to be self-seeking to do that. You don't have to try to get the victory over everybody else to do that, I believe is what he's saying. It's sown in peace by those who make peace. That's how heavenly wisdom works. All right, so in the 10 seconds we have left, key concepts: faith without works is dead. James and Paul agree. The tongue is very powerful, creates a lot of evil. The tongue must be bridled or it will destroy you, it will burn you up. If we are double-tongued, we are double-minded. Wisdom is not selfish, bitter, or envious. It's pure, peaceful, gentle, yielding, merciful, impartial, and unhypocritical. Sorry to not have timed that out very well. My tongue got to saying too much at the first part of class. But don't judge me.
Did it in wisdom, right?
What's that?
Did it in wisdom.